I've lived in this house for more than 50 years, and every creak of the floorboards, every scent of aged wood and lavender, tells me stories only I remember. My garden is a riot of colors this spring, tulips bending in the breeze, roses stubbornly reaching for the sun, and sometimes I sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching them sway, feeling as if the world outside could never touch me. But I was wrong. Thomas and Diane have always been careful. They smile, they nod, they ask about my health. They say all the right things. And yet, over the past few months, their attentions have been tinged with something else: restlessness, impatience, a kind of hunger that has nothing to do with concern. "Mom, you shouldn't be lifting that watering can by yourself," Diane said one afternoon, her voice honeyed but sharp, as I tugged at a stubborn stalk of peonies. "I've been lifting watering cans for decades, Diane." "I don't need a lecture," I replied, letting the soil crumble through my fingers. She frowned, but didn't press further. Thomas, on the other hand, was inside, examining some papers at the dining table. I caught him muttering under his breath, a barely audible string of complaints. When our eyes met, he forced a smile, one that didn't reach the corners of his eyes. "I've watched children grow into adults, and I've learned to read their little tells." Thomas's smile was the kind that pretends, Diane's concern was the kind that calculates. They were not careless, they were confident in their control, or so they thought. The first warning sign came in small ways. Forgotten appointments, half-hearted calls, and casual remarks about Mom being a burden. I ignored them at first. After all, I've survived far more than petty resentment. But the tone grew sharper, and the smiles more brittle. I started to feel it, the cold air of indifference creeping into my own home. One evening, as I stirred soup on the stove, Diane appeared behind me. She leaned slightly too close, watching the pot. "Mom, we've been thinking, maybe it's time to consider some extra help around the house. You know, someone to make sure things are managed properly." I turned, meeting her gaze. There it was, the subtle expectation that I would yield, that I would agree. I wanted to laugh, but instead I forced my lips into a polite smile. "Managed properly? You mean like having someone else dictate my life?" She shrugged, feigning innocence. "Oh, not at all. Just convenience. For all of us." Convenience. For all of them, perhaps. For me, it smelled of chains. Thomas joined us from the other room, paper in hand. "Mom, we think you're getting forgetful." "Nothing serious, but nothing serious." I interrupted, my voice calm, but my fingers tightening around the spoon. "You mean, you want to take away my independence because I live at a pace that doesn't match yours?" They looked at me, expressions carefully measured. Not surprise. Not guilt. Just the practiced masks of polite children dealing with an elderly parent who is inconvenient. Later, as I sat alone in my favorite armchair, Lily's photographs and old letters from my late husband scattered on the coffee table, I realized that this was not just carelessness or indifference. This was deliberate. They had begun to see me as a liability, a shadow in their carefully curated lives. And that shadow would have to be moved, either by me leaving, or by them finding a way to force me out. I let the thought simmer, quiet and dark. I had survived a war I barely remember, raised children through storms they themselves would never endure, and now they wanted to sweep me aside. Well, that would not happen. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I allowed myself to imagine retaliation. Not loud, not clumsy, but precise. Cold. Public enough to leave an impression that would never fade. The garden remained quiet outside, tulips swaying in the gentle wind. But inside me, a storm had begun. I would wait, watch, and prepare. My children thought they were the hunters, but soon, they would discover that the old woman in the armchair still had teeth. And when that day came, there would be no mercy. I had always prided myself on my memory, my mind sharp even as my body creaked. But that evening, when Diane and Thomas cornered me in the living room with a stack of documents, I felt a sudden chill, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter draft slipping through the cracked window. "Mom," Diane said, her voice syrupy, "we've been thinking, for your safety, and for everyone's convenience, it might be time to consider moving into Silver Pines." She held up a brochure with glossy photos of wide hallways, cheerful staff, and neatly arranged rooms. I looked at it, letting the images slide over my gaze. I had visited such places before, not for me, never for me. They were for people who needed guidance, for people who could not fight back. And yet, the smile on Diane's face suggested she expected me to nod, to accept, to relinquish my home and my independence. I shook my head, voice calm, almost light. "You've mistaken your convenience for my care. I don't need moving, arranging, or managing. I am quite capable of caring for myself." Thomas stepped forward, holding a thick folder. "Mom, we've already arranged for some paperwork. Legal stuff. It's all in your best interest. You know, for your protection. We've spoken with Dr. Monroe." I froze as I glanced at the papers. My name was there, signatures in spaces I did not recall filling. They had prepared forms for guardianship, financial control, and consent to move me. All neatly typed, all persuasive, all assuming my compliance. "What's this?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. "I don't remember signing these." Diane smiled. "We just wanted to make it easier, Mom. For all of us." "Easier?" My voice rose, steady but sharp. "You mean taking my house, my independence, and my choices because you think I am inconvenient?" Thomas's face tightened, but he tried to mask it. "Mom, this is for your safety. We're just thinking ahead." I laughed quietly, a short, bitter sound. "Safety. How convenient. You've been plotting behind my back while smiling like dutiful children." Diane's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, before she returned it. "We love you, Mom. But you must understand, we're doing this to protect you." "Protect me?" I said, the words tasting like acid. "You protect me by erasing my life? By taking control of my home, my money, my choices?" They exchanged a glance, practiced and cold, as if reading from an unspoken script. But I saw it, the subtle arrogance, the satisfaction they felt in their cleverness. They believed I was powerless, that age had dulled my ability to resist. For a long moment, the room was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock above the mantel. I stared at both of them. My mind, once clouded with polite hesitation, cleared. The anger that had simmered under polite smiles, the hurt from their subtle dismissals, the betrayal, every ounce of it coalesced into something sharp, deliberate. "You think I'm helpless," I said softly, letting the words sink like a stone into the thick carpet of their arrogance. "You think that age means obedience, that love can be twisted into compliance. But you're wrong. Dead wrong." They both looked startled, but quickly masked it. Thomas opened his mouth, probably to insist on reason, but I silenced him with a hand gesture. "Do not test me," I said. My voice, though low, carried a weight they could not ignore. "I have lived longer than either of you have dreamed. I have endured more than you could fathom. And you think signing a few papers and showing a brochure gives you power." Diane's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the folder. I noticed the subtle twitch in her jaw, the micro-expressions that betrayed fear she would not admit. Thomas's posture stiffened. They had assumed I would submit, they had assumed weakness. I folded my arms, and for a moment, I let the silence settle. Then I smiled, faint, controlled, and utterly dangerous. "Enjoy your little victory for now," I said, because soon, you will realize just how wrong you were to think I'm defenseless. Later, as they left my home, satisfied with their maneuver, I sat down in my armchair, feeling the fire begin to kindle inside me. Betrayal was a potent thing, but it was also fuel. They had handed me the spark I needed. I would wait, I would watch, and I would plan. Small wins first. Psychological maneuvers. Patience. Evidence. Every weakness, every flaw, every misstep they thought irrelevant, I would catalog them all. And when the time came, the exposure would be complete, savage, and unforgettable. I rose, shuffling to the window. The evening sky was painted in soft lavender and orange, calm and beautiful. But I knew, deep in my bones, that storms could rise silently. My children had thought they were the hunters. They did not yet realize they had awakened a predator far older, far wiser, and far more dangerous than they ever imagined. The days after Diane and Thomas's betrayal were quiet, but the quiet was heavy. I moved through the house with deliberate care, noticing every detail that might have escaped me before: the fingerprints smudged on my kitchen counters from hurried hands, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering where Thomas had lingered too long, Diane's lipstick stain on the rim of the coffee cup she insisted I drink from first. They believed their plan had worked. They smiled, nodded, and acted as though nothing had changed. But I could see it, in the subtle micro-expressions, the way their eyes darted when I spoke, the stiff cadence of their movements. They were careless now. Arrogant. They assumed my age meant I would fade quietly into compliance. I began keeping notes. Small things at first. The time Diane left the house without notice, the friends she spoke to on the phone that never mentioned me, the little lies Thomas told about expenses and investments. Each observation was catalogued in a small, leather-bound notebook I kept hidden in the bottom drawer of my desk. Mark Bennett, my neighbor, noticed my quiet intensity. He had always been kind, a retired lawyer with sharp eyes and a subtle wit. One afternoon, he stopped by to return a book I had lent him. "Margaret," he said softly, leaning against my gate, "you seem different lately. Not frail, not forgetful. Sharp. Almost dangerous." I let a slow smile spread across my face. "Dangerous," I repeated, testing the word. "Perhaps. Or maybe just awake after being ignored for far too long." He nodded knowingly. "If you ever need advice, or an accomplice, I suppose, I'm nearby." I didn't answer immediately. I studied his face, his easy confidence. Mark had observed people professionally for decades. He could be useful. "I might call on you," I said finally, the weight of the words deliberate. Inside my home, I began experimenting with subtle tests. How would Thomas react if a check for an account he controlled went missing for a day? How would Diane handle an appointment she had scheduled without consulting me? Every small disruption gave me insight, and every slip built my arsenal. They grew reckless. Thomas bragged about a recent business deal in front of my bridge club friends, embellishing the truth and claiming credit for investments I knew he had mismanaged. Diane flaunted her expensive jewelry, discussing family decisions in ways that betrayed her contempt for me. I listened, noted, and catalogued. Isolation became my ally. Alone in my garden, I would whisper to myself, practicing the calm tones I would use when the time came. Alone in the kitchen, I tested my ability to control small chaos, misplaced bills, carefully timed phone calls, questions that seemed innocent but left them flustered. And all the while, I watched them unravel, just a little at a time. They believed they were untouchable, that their arrogance and my age would protect them. I smiled quietly as I realized the cruel irony: their confidence was the very thing that would destroy them. At night, when the house was dark and quiet, I would sit in my armchair, notebook in hand, reviewing the patterns. The hours of observations, the tiny mistakes, the lies they told themselves, they were building my path to the final act. Every misstep was a thread, every secret a weapon. By the end of the week, I had enough information to begin minor manipulations. I could plant small doubts, trigger tiny embarrassments, and sow discord without revealing my hand. Each action tested their reactions, each reaction taught me more. I was no longer just Margaret Whitman, the elderly mother overlooked in her own home. I was the architect of a slow, deliberate reckoning, a storm brewing quietly beneath the surface. And as I closed my notebook that night, I whispered into the silence, "You've underestimated me for the last time. Enjoy your victories while they last, they will crumble under the weight of your own arrogance." Outside, the wind rustled the branches of the maple trees. Inside, the wheels of my mind turned steadily, calculating, precise, and unrelenting. The old woman who had once been dismissed as harmless had begun to awaken, and nothing, not arrogance nor greed, would shield Thomas and Diane from the storm I was about to unleash. The days had grown longer, but the house felt smaller, tighter, charged with tension that only I seemed to notice. Thomas and Diane moved through it like predators in their own claimed territory, unaware that every step, every word, was catalogued, analyzed, and filed in the ledger of my mind. It started with the bills. Thomas had become careless, leaving envelopes stacked haphazardly on the kitchen counter. I took note, tracing payments, cross-checking bank statements. A missed deposit here, an overdrawn account there, a small lie about where funds had gone. Nothing massive, nothing catastrophic, yet. Just enough to watch the ripple when it surfaced. Diane, ever the manipulator, had grown brazen in her social maneuverings. She invited friends over, flaunting jewelry bought with money she claimed was for family improvements, ignoring the subtle hints that I had contributed. She laughed too loudly, her voice carrying through the halls, and I felt a delicious, patient thrill as I observed the tiny cracks forming in her polished facade. I tested them. I misfiled a receipt, casually mentioned a lost check to a neighbor, allowed a friend of Diane's to overhear a misstatement she had made about the household finances. Small, almost imperceptible disruptions. But they reacted, nervously adjusting their stories, questioning their own recollections. Each misstep, each flicker of uncertainty, was fuel. Mark Bennett, ever watchful, offered advice in subtle whispers during our afternoon visits. "Sometimes," he said, flipping through the notebook I had begun to maintain meticulously, "the best revenge isn't dramatic. It's psychological. Make them doubt themselves first, and everything else falls into place." I nodded, sipping my tea. That was the plan: doubt first, chaos second, and only then the final, inevitable exposure. One morning, Diane stormed into the kitchen, her usual sugary tone replaced by thinly veiled irritation. "Mom, did you move my checkbook? I can't find it anywhere." I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "I don't recall touching it." "Perhaps you misplaced it." Her eyes narrowed. "I always keep it on the counter. I didn't touch anything else." I smiled faintly, inwardly savoring the panic I had stirred. Well, we all misplace things from time to time. It's so easy to overlook small details when one is busy, isn't it? She huffed and retreated, muttering under her breath. I opened my notebook and jotted a note: "Diane, prone to visible frustration when control is threatened." Thomas, too, had shown cracks. He boasted about a recent business deal at a neighborhood brunch, embellishing numbers and credit. A friendly listener, discreetly aware of the real figures, had raised a polite but pointed question about the discrepancy. I watched Thomas's smile falter ever so slightly, and I made another note: Thomas, overconfident, responds poorly to factual contradiction in public. By the end of the week, I had accumulated a collection of small victories. No one outside my circle would notice, yet inside, tension had begun to ripple through the household. I had shifted the balance of power, unseen, silent, precise. I also began gathering more substantial evidence. Tax records, bank statements, old emails, anything that could concretely demonstrate mismanagement or deceit. I took photographs of documents Diane had carelessly left in plain sight, recordings of Thomas making boastful claims, and statements from neighbors who had quietly witnessed moments of arrogance or deceit. Each piece was carefully catalogued, time-stamped, and cross-checked. And I planned my moves with patience. Every day, I reviewed the patterns: when they left the house, when they expected me to be distracted, when I could act without risk of discovery. My mind, once quiet in old age, buzzed with strategy, anticipating every reaction, every countermeasure they might attempt. One evening, as I sat by the fireplace, reviewing the week's findings, I allowed myself a quiet smile. "You think you control this house," I whispered into the flickering shadows, "but control is an illusion. And illusions are fragile." Outside, the wind carried the scent of lilacs through the window. Inside, I pored over my notes, refining my plan. Patience had become my weapon. Observation, my ally. And small victories, my proof that even the most arrogant children could be undone by the quiet precision of someone who had nothing left to lose but dignity and everything to reclaim. The first strike was approaching. They did not know it yet. But when it came, it would be subtle, devastating, and utterly unforgettable. The evening of the neighborhood charity dinner arrived, crisp and polished, with soft string music and the scent of roasted chicken drifting through the hall. Diane and Thomas arrived early, as they always did, brimming with the confidence of those who believed themselves untouchable. I followed at a slower pace, using my cane more for appearances than necessity, letting them think I was frail, compliant, and easy to dismiss. They greeted neighbors, exchanged smiles, and laughed at jokes they assumed would make them appear charming. But I observed everything. Every slight exaggeration, every overdone gesture, every boast they believed was unnoticed. Diane had taken the floor first, discussing the renovations she had supposedly overseen at the community center. She spoke with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. I had already spoken with one of the board members discreetly, someone Diane assumed was unaware of the real costs. "So proud of all the work Diane has done," I said, stepping forward as if by accident, my voice soft and sweet. "It's wonderful that the community center looks so lovely after her efforts." Diane beamed, preening under the compliment, unaware of the trap. "Oh, thank you, Mom. I had so much help from the team, of course." I tilted my head, looking thoughtful. "I wonder, the financial reports mention only a fraction of the budget used. And I recall Thomas saying there were some overages." The air shifted instantly. Diane's smile faltered, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "Well, that was—" I smiled sweetly, letting the pause stretch long enough to make everyone notice. "I suppose the paperwork sometimes doesn't capture everything. Mistakes happen so easily, don't they?" Neighbors leaned in, curious. Diane stammered, trying to explain herself, her words tripping over one another. Thomas cleared his throat, trying to redirect the attention, but his usual confidence had cracked just enough to make the audience feel the tension. I let the silence do its work, and I could see it, the subtle doubt creeping into everyone's mind. The polished facade they had worn for years began to show small fissures. Later, at the dessert table, I continued the small strikes. A misdelivered email I had accidentally let slide into Thomas's hands, a rumor planted about Diane's mismanagement, a casually mentioned discrepancy that only those listening closely would catch. Each incident was tiny on its own, but collectively, they unsettled them, forced explanations, and made their composure waver. I noticed Diane's hands tremble slightly as she poured herself tea. Thomas spoke louder than necessary, as if trying to cover embarrassment, but I could see the flicker of panic in his eyes. Their arrogance was unraveling thread by thread, exactly as I had intended. After the dinner, walking home slowly with my cane, I allowed myself a quiet smile. These were small victories, nothing yet public enough to ruin them, but they were proof. Their confidence could be cracked, their arrogance exposed, and their weakness exploited. That night, I reviewed my notebook, tallying minor humiliations and reactions. Diane flustered under public scrutiny, Thomas defensive when questioned about facts. Patterns emerging. Tools in my hands. By the time I went to bed, the fire inside me had grown brighter. Patience, observation, and subtle manipulation were all paying off. My children had made a critical error, they had assumed I was powerless. And nothing could be further from the truth. I whispered into the darkness, letting the words hang in the empty house, "Enjoy your victories tonight, my children. Every move, every boast, every careless gesture, it's all a step toward the reckoning you've earned. And when the final act begins, you will have no one to blame but yourselves." The house was quiet, but I could feel the storm gathering in the air around me. Every paper, every receipt, every careless misstep my children had made was now catalogued in my notebook. By now, I had accumulated enough evidence to unravel them completely. Bank statements, emails, social invitations, even their boastful remarks at parties, they were all threads in the tapestry I was about to pull apart. Mark Bennett visited often, always with a quiet smile and an observant eye. That afternoon, as we sat at my kitchen table, sipping tea and reviewing the stacks of documents I had compiled, he leaned back, folding his hands. "You've been very patient, Margaret," he said. "But patience only works if you strike at the right moment. Are you ready?" I looked at him, my hands folded calmly over the notebook, my voice measured. "Not yet. Patience is my weapon. Timing is my sword. Strike too soon, and they'll recover. Too late, and the opportunity might slip away. Everything must be perfect." Mark nodded. "Then the trap is set. Everything is in place, and the pieces are moving exactly as you predicted. They still believe they are untouchable. Perfect. Arrogance makes mistakes." I allowed myself a small smile, the corners of my eyes crinkling. Arrogance. That word had become a key in my mind, a lock I would turn when the time came. For the next week, I moved carefully, like a shadow weaving through a sunlit room. I ensured Diane would leave her jewelry box unattended while talking to a friend. I made certain Thomas's ledger was exposed briefly when he bragged about a recent profitable venture. Each slip was minor, almost imperceptible, yet it would later form a concrete pattern of greed and dishonesty that could not be denied. I also coordinated with Mark on the final stage. He had discreetly verified each document, time-stamped each email, and confirmed the legality of the evidence I would use. There would be no room for argument, no chance for my children to escape responsibility. And then, the final move. I sent out invitations for a family reunion and community gathering at my house. My children, confident in their assumed dominance, accepted immediately. They believed it was a celebration of their accomplishments, an opportunity to flaunt their success and social prowess. Perfect. In the days leading up to the gathering, I rehearsed my calm, deliberate tone. I practiced the pauses, the subtle inflections, the moments that would make my words strike with surgical precision. Revenge was not about anger, it was about clarity, control, and timing. The night before the event, I sat by the fire, reviewing every detail. The wine glasses, the seating arrangements, even the placement of the documents, they would all play their part. Diane would sit where she could be subtly observed. Thomas would take the center of attention, confident that he commanded the room. Every assumption they held was a weakness I intended to exploit. I closed my notebook and whispered to the empty room, "Tomorrow, you will see. Every lie, every boast, every misdeed, all exposed. And I will be there, calm, watching, untouchable. You've underestimated me for the last time." Outside, The wind rustled the leaves of the maple trees, and the night sky glittered with stars. Inside, a plan years in the making, meticulously crafted, precise, and utterly savage, was ready to unfold. When the day came, they would enter thinking they were victorious. By the end of it, they would know the truth. The old woman they dismissed, the mother they betrayed, had orchestrated a reckoning they would never forget. And I, Margaret Whitman, would watch every last moment of their humiliation, savoring the cold, brutal justice I had patiently built. The day arrived crisp and clear, sunlight spilling over the manicured lawns as if the world itself had no idea what was about to unfold inside the Whitman house. Diane and Thomas arrived early, dressed impeccably, smiles broad and confident. They believed this gathering was a stage for their triumph, a celebration of their control and cleverness. They were wrong. I greeted them at the door with a serene smile, my cane in one hand, a carefully arranged stack of files in the other. "Welcome," I said softly. "I'm so glad you could make it." They barely glanced at me, striding into the house as if they owned it already. Diane laughed, Thomas shook hands with neighbors, and I allowed myself the tiniest flicker of satisfaction. They were oblivious to the storm that had been quietly building for months. The living room filled quickly with friends, neighbors, and a few curious onlookers. I had intentionally invited the people who mattered, those who would notice inconsistencies, who knew the truth about small misdeeds, and who could confirm facts that my children assumed were hidden. I began casually, with a toast. "To family, and to honesty," I said, raising my glass. The words were simple, but the weight behind them carried a quiet edge. Diane's smile faltered slightly. Thomas's hand shook just enough to rattle his glass. Perfect. As conversation flowed, I waited, watching every twitch, every glance, every subtle sign of unease. Then I moved to the first strike, a subtle, almost accidental revelation. I let a folder slide off a side table, just enough for a neighbor to pick it up and comment aloud. "Oh, these must be the community center reports Diane mentioned," one neighbor said, flipping through the pages. Diane's voice rose, brittle. "Oh, those are, internal drafts." "Drafts?" I asked, voice soft, almost innocent. "They look quite complete." The room shifted, attention slowly turning toward her. Eyes scanned the papers. Questions followed. Diane stammered, trying to justify budget discrepancies and misallocated funds. I let her struggle, calm, patient, collecting every reaction like currency. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, I unveiled Thomas's errors. "And Thomas," I said lightly, holding up a few envelopes and statements, "I noticed some of the numbers you shared at last week's brunch didn't quite match reality." He blinked, attempting a casual laugh. "Mom, numbers matter, don't they?" I interrupted, letting the pause stretch. Especially when bragging about success in front of others. Faces turned, neighbors murmured, and Thomas's confidence began to crumble. I handed Mark a discreet signal, and he began distributing copies of carefully time-stamped emails, bank statements, and photographic evidence of discrepancies. Every boast, every careless misstep, every arrogance-fueled lie was laid bare. Diane's face paled. Thomas's jaw tightened. Their carefully constructed facades were disintegrating in real time. The whispers grew, the questioning increased, and the public attention, neighbors, friends, acquaintances, focused entirely on them. I watched, serene, unmoving, as their world shifted beneath their feet. Diane tried to deflect, Thomas attempted a weak protest, but the evidence was undeniable. Everything they had assumed hidden was now exposed to everyone present. "Mom," Diane began, her voice trembling, "this isn't fair." I raised my hand, calm and precise. "Fair? You speak of fairness after plotting to remove me from my own home, undermining me, and betraying the trust one gave you? I don't think so." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but the room was no longer his. Neighbors whispered confirmations, some nodding in quiet shock, others outright chuckling at the irony. They were losing control entirely, and I let them. I finished the evening with a quiet declaration, voice steady and unyielding: "This house, this life, is mine. I gave you every chance to respect me, and you chose arrogance and betrayal instead. Let this moment remind you, underestimating an old woman can be your undoing." The room was silent for a beat, then murmurs turned to applause, not for my children, but for the clever, calm, and relentless justice I had executed. Diane and Thomas retreated, faces flushed, humiliated, and utterly exposed. Later, as the last guests left and the house settled into quiet, I sank into my armchair, notebook closed, glass of tea in hand. I let a slow, satisfied smile spread across my face. The storm had passed. Justice had been served. Brutal. Cold. Perfect. Outside, the wind whispered through the maple trees, carrying the scent of lilacs. Inside, I felt the rare and exhilarating clarity that comes with total victory. My children had learned a lesson they would never forget, and I had reclaimed everything they tried to take. And in that quiet, I whispered to the empty room, "Never forget, Thomas and Diane, the older you grow, the sharper your mother becomes." Sometimes the people who hurt us the most think we're powerless, but patience, cunning, and timing can turn the tables completely. If you loved seeing Maggie's savage revenge, smash that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe for more stories where justice is served with a twist.